Hello and welcome to Frontrunner Motorsport. It's been a while since I started my 3-part series on every Brabham Formula 1 driver ever, listed from worst to best. But now we are looking at the top 15 drivers, the 15 best to ever race for the Brabham team. We have previously looked at some good and some dreadful drivers from the history of the long dead Brabham team. From Giovanna Amati, Richard Roberts, Mark Blundell, to the very best in Formula One's long history. Brabham really had it all. So now let's go through their race winners and champions, plus a few others who did well for the team. Without further delay, make sure you subscribe, watch parts 1 and 2, and let's jump into part 3 of the every Brabham driver ever ranked from worst to best. Number 15, Martin Brundle. A name familiar to anyone who has watched Formula 1 in the last 40 years. Martin Brundle has been driver and commentator since 1984. After finding some success in touring cars and a hell of a battle with Ayrton Senna in British Formula 3, Martin Brundle debuted in Formula 1 with the Tyrrell team and spent the next 15 years jumping around from team to team. After a few difficult years with Tyrrell and a shockingly poor one with Zakspeed, Martin Brundle decided to take some time away from Formula 1 and began a long successful partnership with TWR Jaguar in sports car racing. In 1989 he returned to Formula 1 with the Brabham team, but after some initial good performances that didn't yield good results, Brabham's form nosedived for the rest of the year and Brundle went back to sports car racing in 1990, winning Le Mans. He returned to an even more broken Brabham team for 1991, now really on their last legs, and Brundle did his best but couldn't drag the Yamaha powered car to any really good results. He spent the rest of his time in Formula 1 with Benetton, Ligier, McLaren and Jordan and got good results and had the occasional massive crash. He retired from racing after the 1999 season and has been in the commentary booth ever since. The poor results don't tell the full story of Brundle at Brabham. There were plenty of good performances, but the car didn't match the driver and rarely made it to the end of races, if it was capable of qualifying for them at all. Number 14, Stefano Moder. The 1987 International F3000 champion was rewarded with a one-off drive with Brabham to finish off the 1987 Formula 1 season. It proved to be a lot tougher than Moder was prepared for and he retired due to exhaustion. Desperate to stay in Formula 1, Moder joined Eurorun for 1988, which was a poor choice, but returned to Brabham in 1989 to partner Martin Brundle, scoring the team's only points at Monaco with a 3rd place, inherited from Brundle after a battery issue. But the poorly funded team struggled to keep performances steady and they dropped off towards the tail end of the year. Stefano Moder stayed with the team for 1990, but it was not a smooth ride, with new Brabham owner Yokum jailed for fraud and the team having an ownership crisis. It was a dreadful year. Moder scored points at the first race and that was all for Brabham. Much like Martin Brundle, performances don't match the results and Brabham badly let down both drivers. Stefano Moder moved to Tyrrell for 1991 and put in some excellent drives, but it still just never worked out for him, nor did it in 1992 at Jordan. And after that, Moder moved on to touring cars, taking wins in DTM and having his final racing year in the revived DTM series in 2000. Number 13, Hector Rebaca. The Mexican businessman who self-financed his whole racing career with the help of his father, Hector Rebaca spent his early years in sports car and Formula Atlantic on both sides of the Atlantic. Eventually he decided to give Formula 1 a go and had 6 attempts with Hesketh in 1977, failing to qualify for 5 of those races and retiring from the German Grand Prix. He went a different route for the next couple of years. Running his own team, he scored a single point in the Customer Lotus before the debut of his own chassis, finished the team off after just 3 races in the HR100. He joined Brabham halfway through 1980, replacing Riccardo Zannino, and scored his 2nd Formula 1 point in Canada. His final year in Formula 1 was his most successful, scoring a few points finishes and finishing 10th in the overall standings. He took a win in the kart series in 1982 and retired from racing in 1983. Number 12, Hans Joachim Stuck. I'm not going to cover the entirety of Hans Joachim Stuck's 50-year career. The guy still races occasionally. He finished 2nd in the European GT2 Pro-Am category in 2021 for Pete's sake. In those 50 years, Hans Joachim Stuck has done a lot of winning, starting with the 1972 Deutsche Rennsportmeisterschaft and then finishing 2nd to Patrick Depailler in the 1974 European Formula 2 Championship, ahead of Jacques Lafitte, Jean-Pierre Jabouet, Patrick Tambay and John Watson, in what must have been a stacked championship. Meanwhile, he started his Formula 1 career with March, racing for the team between 1974 and 1977 whilst also racing in sports cars. He joined Brabham in 1977 when the team ran under the Martini Racing banner and Stuck nabbed a couple of podiums, but despite some good results he was replaced for 1978 by Niki Lauda. He raced for Shadow and ATS, but as he was a tall man, Formula 1 cars were becoming uncomfortably small for him. And Stuck moved back to sports cars, winning Le Mans 3 times with 7 podiums and taking the 1990 DTM title. He was still winning 24-hour races in the mid-2000s. An absolute legend. Number 11, Rolf Stomlen. Another quality sports car driver who had one hell of a strange Formula 1 career. Rolf Stomlen raced in Formula 1 for 9 years, rarely did the full season and raced for some very unusual teams. He actually debuted in Formula 1 in a Roy Winkelmann owned Lotus, finishing 8th in the German Grand Prix of 1969. He brought Auto, Motor und Sport sponsorship to Brabham for 1970 and had his best Formula 1 season with a podium in Austria. After his single season with Brabham, he raced for Surtees and Team Eifelland Caravans before rejoining Brabham for a few races in 1973 without points and ending his time in Formula 1 with Embassy Hill, where he was involved in a big crash that killed 5 spectators, RAM, Hesketh and a new team called Arrows. He also joined Brabham a third time for a couple of races in 1976, scoring a point. Outside of Formula 1 he scored multiple podiums at Le Mans, won the 24 Hours of Daytona 4 times, but sadly he was killed in 1983 driving a Porsche, which he did for much of his career at Riverside. Number 10, John Watson. A debut in a Brabham run by the short-lived Goldie Hexagon Racing before standing in for Brabham at Watkins Glen, Watson retired from both the races he started in 1973. After a full season for Hexagon in 1974, he raced for Surtees, Lotus and Penske in 1975. Watson went on to take a shock first win for Penske at Austria in 1976, which earned him a full-time drive with Brabham for 1977 and 1978. There were some incredible performances in 1978, including almost taking a win until a fuel issue relegated him to second on the last lap. In fact, the car hampered Watson a hell of a lot during his time with Brabham. In 1978, he would finish 6th overall and even outpaced teammate Niki Lauda at times. Watson would move on to McLaren and become a real title contender before he hung up his F1 helmet in 1983, bar a one-off drive in 1985. He attempted the 24 Hours of Le Mans for a few years without success, and the 5-time race winner would move on to commentary and various journalistic roles. Number 9, Niki Lauda. The great Niki Lauda only makes it to 9th on this list. You have to understand the 3-time Formula 1 champion did not have a very happy couple of years with the Brabham team. Lauda had an understated start to his time in Formula 1 with teams such as March and BRM. Points were very rare. In fact, he didn't score points until his 18th race in 1973. From there though, he joined Ferrari, took 15 wins for the Scuderia and 2 of his world championships. But after the famous events of 1976, Lauda's relationship with Ferrari turned sour and he left for Brabham and $1 million. Unfortunately, reliability would be a huge issue. Niki Lauda only won a couple of races for Brabham, both in 1978, the first of which was in the famous fan car in Sweden, which was dropped after one race because of protests from just about everyone else. Lauda failed to finish in 9 races in 1978, but the races he did finish, he finished on the podium, and it was good enough for 4th in the final standings. 1979 was an embarrassment for Lauda. He retired from 11 of 13 races and quit the team before the final 2 rounds. He finished 14th overall, his worst season since leaving BRM. He retired from racing and started a successful airline before returning to McLaren and winning another championship, being involved in Formula 1 until his death in 2019. One of the all-time legends, a race winner for Brabham, but his main success was found elsewhere. Number 8, Jackie Ickx. The Belgium has done it all in motorsport, except winning the Formula 1 title. 6 wins at Le Mans, he's won the Bathurst 1000 and the Dakar Rally. He's a champion in Can-Am and touring cars. In Formula 1, he won 8 races and finished runner-up in the championship twice. One of those times was with Brabham. After starting with Tyrrell in Cooper, in part-time drives in 1966 and 1967, Ickx raced for Ferrari in 1968 and had his first successes, winning in France and finishing 4th overall. In 1969 he joined the Brabham team after a slow start. He won in Germany and Canada and finished runner-up overall behind Jackie Stewart. As good as his season with Brabham was, Ickx moved back to Ferrari, had even more success before seeing out his time in Formula 1 with McLaren, Williams, Lotus, Walter Wolf, Ensign and Ligier. Jackie Ickx has to be one of the best never to win the Formula 1 championship. Number 7, Dan Gurney. The second ever Brabham driver and the first not named Brabham was American Dan Gurney. After starting in Formula 1 with Ferrari, after impressing at Le Mans in 1959, Gurney raced for BRM and Porsche before joining the new Brabham team in 1963. Gurney would take the team's first championship win at the 1964 French Grand Prix and would take 10 podiums in his 3 seasons with the Brabham team, often outpacing the legendary Jack Brabham. He left the team to form the Anglo-American Racers and took a win in the Eagle, but the American efforts were short-lived and not very successful. Gurney would do a one-off race for Brabham in 1968 and a few for McLaren, but soon returned to America, where he would have a number of wins in the USAC series and a few podiums in the Indy 500. He was instrumental, along with other team owners, in the formation of the Kart Racing Series as it broke away from USAC. Dan Gurney is one of the greatest American race drivers ever, which is in itself quite a distinction to have, but he was also one of the best Americans in Formula 1 and the best American to race for Brabham. Number 6, Denny Holm. Dan Gurney's replacement at Brabham was Kiwi Denny Holm, a man who waited in the wings and jumped at the chance to make his debut in Formula 1 with Brabham, having raced the car in various non-championship events. In 1966, when Brabham hit the front of the field and Denny Holm took multiple podiums on his way to 4th in the championship. In 1967, he went one better and won the Drivers' Championship with wins at Monaco and the Nordschleife and a podium at almost every other race. He didn't stay with Brabham beyond the 1967 season, joining McLaren for the rest of his time in Formula 1, winning 6 more races. He left motor racing behind in 1974, but would often return in touring car races in his native New Zealand, and was a regular in touring cars and truck racing throughout the 1980s. He was a big fan of the Bathurst 1000 and raced in the mountains many times, sadly passing away during the 1991 running of the event. Number 5, Ricardo Petra. The Italian had a long career in Formula 1 and that included 2 spells with Brabham. Neither was overly successful, but as befits a man like Petra, he was very good over every season, even when the car did not work, which was often. Petra began his time in Formula 1 with Shadow, but really made a name for himself with the very young Arrows team, taking the British outfit's best results in Formula 1. This earned him a drive with Brabham in 1982. Reliability was a massive issue, but Petra did take his first win at the incredible 1982 Monaco Grand Prix, even after spinning late on and dropping to 3rd. Despite the win, Petra only finished 10th in the championship because the fragile Brabham rarely made it to the end of races. 1983 was even worse and Petra left the team after taking his second win for Brabham. His time at Benetton was again heavily affected by reliability and he returned to Brabham in 1986. The team had one of the most powerful engines, fragile engines, but certainly powerful. The team were a shadow of their former selves at this point and results were atrocious. Despite Petra's best efforts and as Brabham began their swift descent to the end of their life, Petra left for a successful spell at Williams before rejoining Benetton for one final year in 1993, finishing his racing career with spells in touring cars. Absolutely deserves to be in the top 5. If the Brabham cars of the mid-80s were capable of finishing races, Petra could have been a title contender. As it is, we'll never know if he was capable of leading a championship with a top team. Number 4, Carlos Pace. The tragic story of the immensely talented Carlos Pace, who barely got a decade in motorsport before his death. He followed in the footsteps of fellow Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi, racing in Brazil in the late 60s before moving to the UK for 1970. He won one of the British Formula 3 championships of several, and moved up to Formula 2 with Williams, but did not score any points. Frank Williams moved Carlos Pace up to Formula 1 for 1972, but the Brazilian struggled in a backmarker car, scoring a couple of points. He moved to Surtees for 1973 and half of 1974 and did a lot better, even getting a podium in Austria. He moved to the Goldie Hexagon Racing team, but only briefly as Brabham came calling towards the tail end of the 1974 season, and Pace quickly got up to speed with the car, finishing second at the final race of the year in America. Brabham were competitive in 1975, and Carlos Pace took his only Formula 1 win in front of his home crowd and helped Brabham to second in the Constructors. 1976 saw a change from Brabham to Alfa Romeo engines, which proved unreliable and results were tough to come by, but the car improved for 1977 and pace started the year with a second place in Argentina and competitive performances at Brazil and South Africa that were halted by reliability issues. Carlos Pace sadly died in a light aircraft crash a couple of weeks later and never got a chance to live up to his full potential. The Interlagos track is named in his honour, and if not for reliability, he may have had many more wins for Brabham. Number 3, Carlos Reitman. From one Carlos to another, Carlos Reitman was the top Brabham driver for a fair while before chasing Niki Lauda out of Ferrari and into the warm welcoming arms of the Brabham team. Reitman joined Brabham in 1972 after finishing runner-up to Ronnie Peterson in European Formula 2. Reitman managed to get pole on his debut in his home country of Argentina, but the Brabham was off the pace and he didn't score many points. The car would improve over the next couple of years, with Reitman taking a couple of podiums in 1973 and his first wins in 1974. Issues with reliability meant he only finished 6th overall. 1975 would be the closest he would come to winning the Formula 1 Championship with Brabham, despite only taking one win in Germany. He was more consistent through the year and netted a fair few podiums, and finished 3rd overall, although some way behind champion Niki Lauda. The team switched to Alfa Romeo engines in 1976 and reliability was woeful, so Reitman left mid-season, joining Ferrari and then Williams, where he became a real title contender. He'd continue racing occasionally into the 80s and spent much of his later life as a politician. Carlos Reitman died in 2021, but Carlos kept the Brabham team going between their successes in the 60s and 80s and was the best of the Brabham drivers racing for the team in the 70s. Number 2, Jack Brabham. The man who started it all and its first champion, somehow only good enough for second. Jack Brabham is a top star in Formula 1 history. Arguments can be made that he was one of the greatest of all time. He's that good. A lot of his Formula 1 success came before Brabham team was formed, winning 2 Formula 1 championships with the Cooper team. Whilst winning these championships, he was joined by Ron Tauranac in starting the Motor Racing Development or Brabham Racing team. Jack left Cooper to race for his own team from 1962 onwards, scoring the first points for a Brabham chassis at Watkins Glen. It was a rough start, but eventually Brabham in the Brabham, along with teammates from 1963 onwards, started to score good points. Whilst podiums were scored over the next few years, Jack would have to wait till the French Grand Prix of 1966, which kicked off a 4-race win streak that helped Jack Brabham to take his 3rd and final title, with the team bearing his own name. Brabham finished second to his teammate Denny Holm in 1967, and 1968 was atrocious, with Jack retiring from almost every race, and results didn't really improve over the next couple of years. Brabham eventually sold up to Ron Tauranac and retired from racing. Much to his wife's chagrin, his 3 sons also took up racing and reached a pretty high level. Unfortunately, one of them's dodgy as hell, but at least he has 2 good sons. Number 1, Nelson Piquet. It would take one hell of a driver to keep the team founder and first champion off the top spot, and Nelson Piquet was one hell of a driver. Piquet had broken records in British Formula 3 and was rewarded for his fine form with a drive for Ensign. Thanks, I guess. But then he got a drive with BS Fabrications. Brabham picked Piquet up for the final race of 1978 and kept him on for 1979, which turned out to be a good bit of business. Much of 1979 was spent at the side of the track under a cloud of smoke as the Alfa Romeo engines were hideously unreliable. The story of Brabham is made up of broken engines. For 1980 they switched to Cosworth power and results improved. Piquet took his first win at Long Beach and 2 others later in the year, finishing runner-up to Alan Jones in the championship. He did get a consolation prize in the BMW M1 Championship, which had a ton of Formula 1 talent racing in it. Nelson Piquet won his first championship in 1981, taking advantage of the squabbling Williams teammates to take the crown. For 1982, Brabham switched engines again from Cosworth to BMW. Immensely powerful but incredibly unreliable, Nelson Piquet retired from nearly every race and ended the year 11th, but bounced back in 1983 to win his second championship. His final 2 years with the team were plagued with reliability issues, but Piquet did take the occasional win before moving on to Williams and becoming a 3-time champion before ending his time in Formula 1 with Lotus and Benetton, taking his final win at the Canadian Grand Prix of 1991. Since then, we have seen his son race in Formula 1 and become a controversial moment. Interviews with Piquet have surfaced where he has referred to many in scandalous ways. He's now banned from the F1 paddock. But a controversial team like Brabham almost deserved to have a controversial individual as their greatest ever driver. So we have finally come to the end of our ranking every Brabham Formula 1 driver ever from worst to best trilogy. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have placed any of these drivers differently? Maybe you have a different idea for the best Brabham driver ever. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, lots more motorsport content on the way, as the racing scene really starts to kick into high gear for 2024. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.